This video's not even for you, but welcome back anyway to OG's Danger Show.
Calling back in on Travel 600 North Line, 600 North Line, permit 4 up at 911 line. Anyhow, back in.
So I'm releasing this video on July 6th, 2020, exactly 2 years to the day that my daughter and I were snorkeling in Samos, Greece, and we were pulled out to sea by a heavy current. We were rescued and brought to Turkey, where we spent an unplanned 4 days in a Turkish jail. So I'd like to include some photos and video that I've accumulated over that time and while I was there, and tell you the full story so that my kids and grandkids have it all documented here on YouTube. So you might have seen this story over on Taofledermaus. We talked about it briefly the summer after it happened, but I wanted to include a lot more photos and video from inside Turkey and from inside of a Turkish jail that you have not seen before. I think it's kind of interesting, and I wanted to show you even some Turkish news footage about this story. So we begin with a flight from Los Angeles to Athens, Greece. My family and I, my wife, 2 daughters, my niece, and my mom all visited Athens, Greece for a few days, saw all of the sights that tourists are required to see when they're in Athens, and visited all of the monuments, saw a beautiful city. It was awfully hot over there. It was July in Athens, so it was nice and warm and humid. We spent the 4th of July in Athens, and I couldn't help but notice they have no fireworks over there. Just kidding, folks. See, they have no fireworks because 4th of July is just another day to them. So it was a great trip. You're going to see in this picture here my mom and my niece on the left, my daughter Michael in the center, my wife, Mrs. OG, and my daughter Megan on the right. One of the highlights of our time in Athens was going to the Parliament building and watching the changing of the guard in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier. Extremely hot out there that day, but it was really impressive to see these guys in full wool uniforms doing this ceremonial changing of the guard. So on July 5th, we hopped on a ferry, all of us, sat in a really nice seat and took an overnight trip out to the island where my great-grandfather comes from, the island of Samos, Greece. The island of Samos is called by the locals the Green Island and sometimes the Fish Island because of its shape. It's one of the easternmost islands in the collection of Greek islands, and it's located less than 2 miles from mainland Turkey. My great-grandfather comes from a little town called Marathokopos, and legend has it that he used to swim across the body of water that separates Samos, Greece, and Turkey. This is a little strip of water called the Mikalis Strait. As we zoom in here, you can see mainland Greece, the island of Samos, and mainland Turkey, and this gives you an idea of just how close the island of Samos is from mainland Turkey. Now, our intention had been to spend a few days wandering around the island of Samos and seeing all the sights, laying on the beach. Mrs. OG's birthday was the 7th of July, so we planned a very relaxing birthday celebration for her on the island. So if you've ever made plans, you know that something's always going to happen and those plans are going to go awry. We woke up on the morning of July 6th and had breakfast at the bottom of the Artemis Hotel, and then went down the sidewalk and bought some snorkeling gear, masks and flippers from a local shop, with the intention of going to Samos, a tropical little beach on the other side of the island. We would need 2 taxis to get all of us over there. The gentleman who sold us the masks and snorkels even warned us. He says, just be careful of the currents and watch for the signs. The signs will tell you how far out you can go. So we loaded up and went to Samos. We took this picture as soon as we got outside the taxi. And we walked on down to the beach, decided to get all settled in at the beach. We rented some cabanas here before we went to get lunch at a local restaurant. So we got ourselves settled on this beach, got all of our stuff dropped off, and decided, hey, the water looks really cool, nice and hot outside. Let's put on our snorkeling gear before lunch and head out into the water here and do some snorkeling real quick. Take a look out on that little bay and see that little strip of rocks? That little strip of rocks appeared to be only a few hundred yards offshore, and it appeared that there was a Greek flag flying on that strip of rocks. Here's another view from up high. You can see the island of Samos, Greece, that little strip of rocks out there, and then you can see mainland Turkey just past it. And as we look over the satellite map here, you'll see how all of this lays out. So at the top of your screen, you'll see the little bay of Samos, where we were sitting on the beach. And out in the middle of that bay, you'll see the strip of rocks next to that little cloud. Now, out in the middle of the Mykonos Strait, you'll notice a round island about the size of 2 football fields. It had a little building on it, and we learned that the island was called the Flag Island. So both daughters, the niece and I, were out snorkeling around, having a good time in the water. These are almost like tropical waters, very, very clear. You could see the sandy bottom of this. You could see little fish floating around. We were having a good time. This was all very shallow and warm here. You could stand up on the white sand bottom of this little bay. Everyone was having a good time. I even had my cell phone out there in a little protective case that allowed me to get some video underwater. So my youngest daughter Megan and I decided to snorkel out to the little strip of rocks. I handed off my phone to my niece, and Megan and I set out for that little strip of rocks out there. It was a very easy swim, very shallow water, warm, little fish everywhere, and we had a good time. After an easy 20-minute swim, we landed on the strip of rocks. It was very rocky and sharp out there, so we took off our fins, sat on the rocks for a couple of minutes, unable to hike around, but we could very clearly see the Greek flag mounted on a flagpole. After a couple of minutes, we decided, hey, why don't we try and swim out a little bit further to that little round island? We could see that there was a building on it and another flagpole. We couldn't make out the flag, but it didn't look like too far of a swim. We're both fairly strong swimmers. The swim out to the strip of rocks had been very easy, so we decided, let's head out there. So we set off. As we started swimming towards the little island, we noticed that the bottom, the white sandy bottom was dropping away, and pretty soon we were in deep, deep blue water, deeper blue than I've ever seen before. There was no bottom to be seen. It was a little unnerving, but it was perfectly fine. The water was still calm, and we were making a straight course for that little island. Now, of course, at the time we didn't know the exact distances, but I have since measured them, and it was about a quarter mile out there. This is a distance I swim all the time. Didn't think it was a big deal. Megan and I, as we got a little bit closer, we could identify doors and windows on the little building on this island, and we kept watching those doors and windows as we got closer and closer. Our plan was to go out there, sit for a couple minutes, and then swim back to the beach at Kusadasi. So it was about this time that I noticed every time I brought my face up out of the water, we were facing towards mainland Turkey and not towards the island anymore. We would adjust our course and keep paddling towards the island. Next time I popped my head up, we were facing Turkey again and not towards the island. And it became apparent to me very quickly that we were drifting away from the island to the right or to the south. We were not getting any closer to the island no matter what we tried to do. Pretty soon it became pretty clear to us that we were not going to reach Flag Island. Instead, we were being pulled towards mainland Turkey. We decided that our best course was to pick a point on mainland Turkey and try and hit that section of the beach. We would find a large boulder or a small beach, and we would start swimming towards that. Pretty soon, we realized that that point was far off to our left. We were being pulled down the shore of mainland Turkey, and we were not able to fix a point on the mainland. So after about an hour of drifting and never getting any closer to shore, we started to wonder when Mrs. OG was going to freak out and possibly send a boat for us. We had seen the Greek Coast Guard at Samos, and we thought that by now she might start getting worried back on the beach and might ask someone or hire someone to come out looking for us, thinking that maybe we had reached the island and had gotten tired and were unable to make it back. Well, after a period of time, Mrs. OG did in fact go for help. She walked into a restaurant and began speaking with an old lady who was being assisted by a young boy who was interpreting. The old lady explained to Mrs. OG that if her family was out in that strait, there was very little likelihood that they had survived. She explained to Mrs. OG that the current in the afternoon picked up out there, the waters became very unpredictable, and that the prior year 70 people had drowned in that very strait. Well, you can imagine what Mrs. OG was going through, thinking that 50% of her family was lost at sea and had presumably drowned in the Mykonos Strait. So for obvious reasons, Megan and I don't have any photos or video of our drifting off to sea, so I'm going to drop in a picture here of the Mykonos Strait while I explain to you what we were going through. After a couple of hours of swimming as hard as we could, I at least became fairly exhausted. I started to panic breathe because I was trying to breathe through a snorkel and a mask. I ended up pulling that thing off and stuffing it in my shorts. Megan kept her mask and snorkel on. So the waves were kicking up higher and higher now. There were times where I couldn't see Megan on the other side of the waves, so I kept calling out and asking her to shout out, identify that she was still there. At one point I rolled over on my back just to rest for a little while, as I was trained to do as a kid. And Megan actually swam over to me and had the good idea of taking the string ties on her swimsuit and tying them to the string ties on my swimsuit so that we couldn't be separated. That was my biggest fear, is that the two of us were going to get separated. And of course, I didn't have the energy to start swimming after her to try and attempt any kind of a rescue. This whole time, she wasn't panicking. She was doing great. She was swimming along there. Every time I called out for her, she replied with, "Yes, Dad, still here." I had rolled over my back. I was looking down at the sunset between my feet, and I was asking Megan to give me directions. So I asked her to give me directions and angle a little bit more towards Turkey or more towards Greece, and so she would keep giving me directions. She was doing just fine this whole time and never freaked out. I, on the other hand, might have freaked out a little bit. There was a period here where I believed that we probably weren't going to make it through this. We'd been out there for 3.5 hours at this point, and it didn't look like we were going to make it through this. So like any parent in the world, quite a few prayers were going up at this time, and all I cared about was that Megan made it to the shore or somehow made it out of this ordeal. I started swallowing a lot of salt water at this point, became pretty demoralized. We were watching the sun go down on our right to the south, and it just didn't look very good for us for a while. So after about 3.5 hours, off in the distance, we saw a sailboat round the corner of mainland Turkey from the south and start traveling up the coastline to the north. We were quite a ways away from it. We were probably half a mile away from that sailboat, but we flailed our arms and screamed and yelled as loud as we could. We used our flippers to kick ourselves up and out of the water, standing, halfway up out of the water, splashing all over the place. But the sailboat passed right on by, too far away from us, and never even saw us out there. So we were pretty bummed out. We had missed what we thought was going to be our only opportunity. Earlier in the afternoon, we had seen from the Greece side, we'd seen all these tour boats that looked like pirate ships, loaded with tourists that had been going up and down the coastline. But because the sun was starting to set, they had long since gone back towards the nearest port city. Another thing that wasn't helping morale a whole lot, although we were a few miles offshore, some of you might be familiar with how sound travels across water. We were able to hear the loud music playing on the beach at Samos. We could no longer make out people back there. We could barely make out ships along the coastline of Greece, but we could make out the music traveling across the water, and it was odd that there's no way anybody knew where we were or could hear us. Well, about 30 minutes after we had seen the sailboat pass by, we saw yet another sailboat come around the bend south of us and start up the coastline of Turkey. This time we were a little closer. We were only about a half a mile from mainland Turkey. We could make out the beach. We could make out the rocks very clearly. We could see a little tiny buildings, but there was no large buildings. There were no cars. There were no people on this side of Turkey. The sailboat that was coming along was half of the distance between us and the mainland Turkey, so about a quarter of a mile away. This time we jumped up, flailed our arms, splashed, made as much noise as we could as the sailboat got close. And lo and behold, if the sailboat didn't slow down and start making two very wide circles around us, and we could see someone on deck that appeared to be looking over in our direction, and we knew that we had just been rescued. Visible on the deck of the sailboat was a Turkish flag, so we knew we had a Turkish sailboat, and we find out later that the captain of the sailboat, while making the large circles around us, was actually radioing in to Turkish Coast Guard, requesting permission to pick us out of the water. It used to be, of course, that anybody could pick anybody out of the water in a distress situation. In recent years, there have been so many Syrians and other nationalities trying to cross through Turkey, seek refuge in the European Union. As soon as they make it into mainland Greece, they are free to move about the entire European Union. Well, all of these Syrian refugees that have passed through that strait has changed the rules a little bit, and now anyone who is found in the water has to be called in, and Turkish Coast Guard has to give permission for even a sailboat to pick people up out of the water. So we ended up climbing a rope into the back of this sailboat. Megan had, I found out later, had dumped her mask and snorkel into the ocean, let it sink to the bottom. She was so excited about climbing onto this ship. I climbed onto the ship, not knowing who we were going to encounter. I had already taken off my neck knife. I'd used that to cut the strings to cut Megan and I apart. We climbed onto the sailboat and thanked profusely the captain for stopping and picking us up out of the water. He gave us a plate with some fruit and cheese and gave us cups of water, which were extremely helpful at that point. Remember, our throats were burned from taking on so much seawater, and boy, you just don't even realize how sore your throat can get with all that seawater. So having some clear water to drink was a great thing. In days gone by, he was able to just take us over to the beach in Samos and drop us back off. We could still see this beach across the water, but because of the new regulations and all the problems with immigration, they now had to turn over anyone in the water to the Coast Guard, the Turkish Coast Guard, not even the Greek Coast Guard, but the Turkish Coast Guard, as we were now in Turkish waters. The man gave me a business card and introduced himself as M. Ferhat Kalsin. He was a businessman out of Istanbul who was down there with his friend just doing a pleasure cruise on a sailboat, and they just happened to see us. Mr. Kalsin let me use his cell phone to call Mrs. OG. She had her cell phone turned off, but I knew that once we had been gone for so long that she would turn her cell phone back on, and I wanted first and foremost to contact her and let her know that we were okay. By this time, we'd already been missing out in open water for approximately 4 hours. So I first sent a text message to her, and then I also called and left a voicemail, which she later got. So while Megan fell asleep on the deck of the ship, I began to realize that while we were safe, and that was my chief concern, that we were both still alive and that we had just finally been picked up from a harrowing situation, I now knew we were in an international incident. We could very well be in some trouble. While Mr. Kalsin was extremely nice himself, he did explain to us that he was going to have to take us northeast, to meet up with the Turkish Coast Guard, and that we would be handed over to the Turkish Coast Guard. At this point, I kind of thought in my head that maybe the Turkish Coast Guard would be able to take us back over to Samos, or at least meet the Greek Coast Guard out in the middle of the water. I was a little naive about such things. I've never been in the middle of an international incident before. Well, after motoring northeast for what seemed like about an hour and a half, we finally were met by a small Turkish Coast Guard ship. I looked over and noticed that one of the crew was wearing a GoPro on his head, and we were later sent a copy of this video. As soon as we stepped aboard the Coast Guard ship, I met the captain, and he introduced himself as Captain John. I assumed his name was John, John. It's actually Can, as the Turkish pronounce it, Chan. As soon as we stepped off the boat onto the pier, we were met by a military guy named Hikmet. Hikmet spoke perfect English, and we found out later that he was on loan from the Army to this Coast Guard unit, sort of a loaner program between the two agencies. Hikmet showed us into an office, a very stark little office. We were brought some clothes. The Coast Guard there in Turkey has a lot of clothes set aside for refugees to be dressed in when they're found and plucked out of the water. And we had just been found and plucked out of the water. Megan was given an oversized white Coast Guard shirt, while I was giving a very tight-fitting t-shirt with Istanbul written across it and a flannel long-sleeve shirt. We still had our swim trunks on underneath, and Megan was given a pair of shoes. I was given a pair of very small, ill-fitting, sort of a Converse knockoff shoe called the Claw. It was made in Turkey, and they are made to look a lot like Chuck Taylor's. Oddly enough, about this time I borrowed someone's phone and I dug up YouTube, and I was able to show them Taofledermaus and how I was actually kind of a shooter on Taofledermaus, and I even explained to them that I used a Turkish shotgun. That sort of broke the ice, and everyone thought that was great fun, that I was on so many videos over at Taofledermaus. We were given some food and snacks, some hot tea. I learned quickly that every single time a visitor is brought into a room or meets someone new, there's a tray of hot tea served up in little clear glasses. It's hot, sweet tea. It doesn't matter if it's cold outside or hot outside. Here comes a glass of hot tea for you. After a few minutes, another gentleman walked in the door who spoke pretty good English. He introduced himself as Ismail. Little did we know, but Ismail would be with us almost constantly for the next 4 days. We found out that Ismail was a bit of not a cruise director, but he owned a company. He ran a company on shore that took cruise passengers. Kusadasi was a resort city that took on a lot of cruise ships. And Ismail took cruise passengers on tours of Ephesus and different places around that part of Turkey. We would soon come to learn that Ismail knew every single person in Kusadasi, and he actually wielded a little bit of power, being that it was a tourist city and he was a tour director. Not only did he know everyone, he knew every police chief. He could walk into any police office right along with us. There were no security checks for him. He could tell any police officer exactly how we were going to be treated and where we were going to go next and what needed to be done next. And everyone followed Ismail's directions. Ismail essentially became our angel. And to this day, I talk with Ismail often by text and by phone. And we are almost like brothers. I feel as if I'm related to this guy. He essentially made our stay there very pleasant and did a lot of work for us over the next several days. Ismail loaned me his phone at one point, and he had already dialed up the U.S. consulate. This was on a Friday night, and there was some new, very young girl working the desk at the U.S. consulate. The first thing she asked me was, "Are you being detained?" And I looked around. I was familiar with the word detention. I knew we were not being detained. We had no passports. We had no cash. We had no ID. We had no clothes, really, other than what they'd given us. But we certainly weren't being detained. We were being treated very, very well by the Turkish Coast Guard and the other people who came to visit. So I didn't feel like we were being detained. The girl took down Ismail's number and we disconnected the call. Soon after that, we were walked out to an outdoor picnic table and served a huge Turkish dinner. We found out that the chef on the big Coast Guard ship that was docked there, his name was Mesut, he had made a huge Turkish dinner for us. And we sat at this picnic table and ate more food than two people could possibly need. And our friend Hikmet had left the area for a minute, and when he came back, he had a huge bowl of some type of a rice or salad that his wife had made for us. He brought it back and added it to the dinner. And while we were eating, he disappeared again and returned a short time later with a bag full of cold Cokes, Coke Zero, chips, and candy bars. And we walked up onto the helipad. You'll see in this picture, Megan and I have a picture here as the sun's going down to the south. We walked up on the helipad overlooking Kusadasi at night, and we sat in a circle of plastic chairs with a couple of Coast Guard members, and we all had a couple of good laughs. And Megan and I finally started to relax a little bit, and we felt like, although we didn't know what was going to happen to us, we felt like that we were amongst friends and that we would be okay. While we were sitting in the office a few minutes before dinner, we had a visit from the local city police. The city police pretty much decided there was nothing they could do with us. They called over the harbor police, who also decided that we were kind of outside their jurisdiction. Then the state police stopped by and visited us, and the state police decided that there wasn't much they could do with us. We were a strange immigration problem. Well, lo and behold, a couple minutes later, two women from the immigration office arrived, and through Ismail's translation, they were able to ask us a couple of questions. They took Megan outside the door and checked with her. Turkey is a very modest country. It's a Muslim country, so they're very modest about men and women and conversations that come up in front of men. So they took Megan out onto the dock and asked her if she was physically okay and checked with her, being a teenage girl. So I thought that was actually pretty cool. Sometime along in the wee hours of the morning, we were taken in a small car, an unmarked car, but with two uniformed police officers, and we were taken to the local hospital. There we were checked out. They wanted to make sure that we were okay since we were guests of theirs and that we were not injured in any way. It was a 5-minute hospital check, and I'll tell you, as a person who takes in custody people to the hospital all the time, we usually spend about an hour or 3 at the hospital. We spent about 5 minutes at the Kusadasi hospital. They deemed us good to go. And then we were taken to a small police station back by the beach. We sat there for what seemed like a couple of hours. We were provided a lawyer. A young girl came in a white dress. She announced that she was our lawyer. She spoke rapid Turkish back and forth with a uniformed officer sitting at a desk. Ismail stood nearby the entire time. I have this strange memory of laying up against the corner near the bench where I was sitting and putting the swim fins that we were still carrying with us, put them up against the corner and laying on them and trying to catch a little bit of sleep. We were so exhausted at this point. Megan was asleep against my shoulder, and I was trying to sleep against the wall while we were waiting for all of this to happen. We were sat down at this desk, interviewed through Ismail, the interpreter, and our lawyer, spoke with the police officer, and we were issued what is essentially 2 citations for illegally entering Turkey. Of course, Ismail found this funny and explained to the police officer that we didn't actually enter Turkey. We were brought into Turkey, and that we weren't refugees trying to get into Turkey. They didn't seem to care a whole lot. They issued us 2 citations that you can see in this picture here for 2,869 Turkish lira. Ismail told us not to worry about this. We had 15 days to pay it, and he assured us we would be long home by then. At this point, we were taken in the police car to the large main police station further up on the hill, where we would spend the majority of the next 4 days. We were walked down to the jail section in the basement, where Ismail told the officer on duty, sitting behind a computer, that we were not to be put into a cell and locked, that we were guests and not inmates. So the officer on duty walked us down a hallway, and we made a right turn, and he put us in some very nice, what appeared to be brand new cells. They had 4 or 5 bunk-style beds inside, and they had a neatly folded blanket at the foot of each bed, and they just appeared extremely clean. I'm familiar with U.S. jails, folks, and this was far cleaner than any U.S. jail I've ever seen. While we were walking down to this wing of the jail, we noticed that other inmates, other people, appeared to be maybe drunks off of the street, were sleeping on hard benches inside of their cells with the doors locked. Ismail made sure that the officer knew that we were not to have our door locked and that we were able to come and go as we please. And sure enough, we were shown the restroom. We were told very clearly that we could walk out of our cell at any time we wanted to and use the restroom and come down to the office and ask them for anything we might need. So it was a little strange situation. We were relieved to finally be on our own and be in a place where we could lay down and get some sleep, but it was a little weird. We're now actually in the basement of a Turkish police station, sleeping inside of a jail cell. So throughout the night, anytime we needed to walk down to the restroom, it was kind of funny. We would look down the hallway and wave at the guard who was sitting in a little glass office at a computer. He would wave back to us and smile. We would wander to the bathroom and then back to our cell, and everybody was happy. The following morning, Ismail met us in the little glass office with the watch officer, and he had brought us little bags of bakery bread and water bottles. So while it may be a little cliche that we had water and bread in Turkish prison, it was actually quite a bit nicer than that. So now it's Saturday morning. For the most part, the police station was closed and mostly empty. There was a couple of officers, plainclothes and uniform officers wandering around, but not very many. Skeleton crew, typical for most police stations around the world on the weekends. We were taken upstairs to a conference room where we were sat down, and it was explained to us that Mrs. OG had managed to get faxed copies of our passports. They were given to a contact in the Greek Coast Guard that we later learned was actually Ismail's brother-in-law. Strange little small world we've got here. They were sent over on a ship and delivered to the police station. So now we had a version of our passports waiting for us that could identify us. Well, it soon became clear to everyone over there that Megan was under 18 years old. And this started a whole different set of procedures. We were taken back to the hospital again for another medical check, both of us. These medical checks took about 3 minutes because we were able to pass the line of people waiting to be seen at the emergency room since we had police with us. We walked into the emergency room and a doctor or a nurse would walk up to us and ask, "What is wrong with you?" And we would say nothing. And they would say, "Okay, you are fine." And we would walk out the door. There was no paperwork involved, and there was no actual medical check going on. All of a sudden, we were back in a car and headed for a courthouse. This was on a Saturday. This was on Saturday, July 7th, Mrs. OG's birthday. And of course, we had no contact with Mrs. OG to even wish her a happy birthday. We were walked into the courthouse. I remember standing there in my loaned clothes and my swim trunks and my tiny shoes, sitting outside with a female officer, while Megan was walked inside to what was essentially a juvenile court on a weekend. She said it was very informal. There was a, quote, judge, end quote, sitting at the end of the table in a polo shirt, and he asked her if she was okay. He basically had to sign some papers that said she was free to leave Turkey and that her citation would suffice and that she wasn't in any kind of trouble with the juvenile system there. Well, Saturday came and went, and we were sitting in the conference room of the police station watching Turkish TV until 12:30 a.m. They had assigned one plainclothes guy to watch us, or to essentially sit across the hallway from us. Anytime we needed to use the restroom or go somewhere, we would just wave at him and walk down the hallway, and he would wave back and didn't bother following us or detaining us or closing a door or anything like that. It was kind of weird to have free roam of a foreign police station being American visitors. It just helped confirm the idea that we were guests and not actually in trouble and being detained there. We sat in the conference room until about 12:30 a.m. The two immigration ladies had arrived and checked on Megan again. Ismail brought us a kebab dinner from a local restaurant. We watched TV until about 12:30 a.m. and then we went down to the jail cell for sleep. Because this was a weekend, a plainclothes officer was usually sitting across the hall from us in the conference room watching World Cup soccer on his phone. Occasionally we would ask him to come into our conference room because we had a big TV and were able to watch the game, and they were very excited to come inside and sit with us and watch soccer games on an actual TV. We realized pretty quickly that these officers were being held over just to babysit us. So the sooner we went downstairs and went to bed in the jail again, they could go home. So even though we might not be tired, we decided at some point that we just needed to head back downstairs and let them go home. We woke up at 5:30 a.m. on Sunday morning and then took another nap until 8:30 a.m. Sometime later that morning, we were told by Ismail that our passports, the actual passports, had arrived from Mrs. OG. She didn't know anything about the Turkish side of things and if it was a trustworthy country. And when our passports arrived, Ismail admonished us to make sure that we kept these things with us at all times and did not turn them over to anybody from here on out. On Sunday, July 8th, we were told that Mrs. OG and my oldest daughter were on their way over. They'd caught a boat. They were required to leave their passports at the port, which is common for all tourists entering Turkey just for the day. Ismail met them at the port and brought them up to the police station in his car, walked them right to the conference room where we were staying, and we had our first reunion since this had all begun. Mrs. OG and my oldest daughter brought our luggage with them. We were ecstatic to finally have clean clothes that didn't smell of salt water and that fit correctly. I remember after having a lunch of McDonald's with them at the conference table, you can see in the picture here, they took off again with Ismail. We found out later that although the ferry was scheduled to leave from the dock, he wanted to take them by and show them Turkish baklava and explain how it was so much better than Greek baklava, and that they were almost late getting back on the ferry headed back to Greece because of Ismail's side trip. Mrs. OG had brought her notes from all of the consulate contacts. I started making my own phone calls, text messages, emails to everyone who could possibly help. And it was nice because now, using the Google Translate app, we could actually communicate with the police officers who were sitting across the hall with us. So you'll see in one of these pictures here, Megan laying on the floor of the conference room working on her phone like teenage girls will do. Megan's boyfriend at the time was talking to her on the phone, and I remember him giving her a load of crap because he felt bad because he was not in the loop and he didn't know where she had been the last few days. And at that point, I remember just losing it and turning around and telling her to hang up on that guy. So Sunday night, we were escorted back down to the jail. We had to turn over our phones to the police officer sitting in the little glass office. But other than that, we were very familiar with the accommodations. We were bummed that we were on our third night in this Turkish jail, and every single day it promised to us that we would be back on a boat headed to Greece. So Monday morning comes along, and we were told that the commander of the police station, the big guy himself, was coming down the hallway soon and would be visiting us in the conference room. He didn't speak any English, and when he arrived, I happened to have in my luggage some patches and badges and challenge coins from my agency. So I gave him a few of these, and he seemed pretty surprised, and I think that worked as a gesture of goodwill. He noticed that Megan was laying over in the corner of the conference room, looking at her phone, talking on her phone, and he whispered something to one of his subordinates, and we were quickly taken to a private apartment that is connected to his office. And we had just been told that a representative from the consulate, a Turkish lady who worked for the U.S. consulate, was coming to visit us. You could tell that this police captain did not want Megan laying on the floor when a U.S. consulate representative arrived. So he whispered something to one of his subordinates. There were quite a few of them gathered around him. And we were taken back into his office, a very lavish office. We were walked through a secret door behind his desk into a private apartment. Even his next in charge, well, I'll call his lieutenant, a uniformed officer that ran around doing everything he wanted, even that lieutenant stepped into this apartment and looked around as if he never knew this thing even existed. We were sat down. You can see pictures here. It was a well-appointed little apartment that had air conditioning and couches and a TV that had English channels. This is the first time we had watched TV that had anything that we could understand. He also showed us to a little mini fridge that he had in there that had beer and water. We had been told earlier that no alcohol was allowed anywhere in the police station, but this commander had a little fridge in his apartment with some Turkish beer and bottles of cold water. So that was a very nice surprise. He also brought us a small tray of Turkish delight. First time I'd ever had such a thing. We were told that we would be staying in this apartment that night and that we would no longer be staying in the jail cell. This was a welcome change. We were a little bit bummed out that we would still be staying another night. However, we knew that we would not be staying in the jail cell. So here's where things get a little interesting. We knew that we were expecting a visit from the lady from the U.S. consulate office. While we were sitting in this commander's private apartment, enjoying cold water and air conditioning, we were looking at our phones and texting back and forth with Mrs. OG and our oldest daughter and Ismail, when all of a sudden our phone stopped working. And my daughter looked over at me and noted that her phone wasn't texting or receiving phone calls or text messages anymore. Megan told me that she thought that our phones were probably being jammed because we were near the commander's office. I told her I didn't think so, that perhaps we were just in a bad spot for cellular service. Well, in this apartment, there was a door. It was shown to us when we were shown the apartment, a door that led out into the hallway, and it was made very clear that we were not confined to the apartment. Anytime we needed to leave, we were welcome to use that door and step out into the hallway, and someone would be there to greet us and take us to wherever we needed to go in the police station. The first time we did this, that uniformed lieutenant came over and immediately escorted us to the restroom. Every single time we opened that door, he was waiting there for us. Whenever we walked back down the hallway to return to that apartment, we noticed at the end of the hallway some sliding glass doors, and it needed special credentials to swipe on the little keypad to get inside those doors. I took this photo here that you see and later translated it and found out that it's actually their secret police. So perhaps Megan was right. I think our phones were being jammed because we were right on the other side of a wall from the secret police headquarters. Well, after getting our phones back, we weren't too crazy about all of a sudden being cut off from Mrs. OG and the rest of our contacts, including the consulate people. So Megan and I grabbed our luggage, we walked out the door, and for some reason, this time the uniformed lieutenant was not waiting for us. There was a small group of people further down the hall that were busy talking in a huddle. They didn't even seem to notice us. We walked with our luggage across a large atrium and got on the elevator and went back up to the 4th floor to the conference room where we had been this entire time. And sure enough, about 30 minutes later, all of a sudden, our phones came back to life. When we pointed this out to the uniformed lieutenant outside the door, he pointed to our phones and showed us that we had 4 bars of service and that, of course, our phones should be working just fine. We mentioned to him that our phones were completely dead, and he stated that he didn't know anything about what was going on. So while we were risking making the police commander angry that we had refused his hospitality, we returned back up to our conference room, where we sat until later in the afternoon, where our consulate contact, a lady by the name of Guliz Balsari, arrived, and she was very excited. We talked with her a couple of times on the phone, but now she was very excited because she had good news for us. She had just come from the district governor's office and had received word that we had been giving the verbal approval to leave. We were just waiting for one more signature on a document to come over the computer, and then it would be official and we would be allowed to leave the police station. Guliz Balsari also told me at one point that there were some people in the higher up government that were skeptical about how an American police officer could do something so silly as to be pulled out to sea, and they thought that there was even a possibility that I was some type of spy and that I'd brought my daughter along as some type of cover. Well, to make a long story longer, we were soon told to grab our bags. We were put inside of a unmarked police car with 2 uniformed officers. You can see in this video, this is us driving down essentially the boardwalk of Kusadasi near the edge of the water. We went to an immigration office, which was upstairs, very near the tiny police station that we had been to twice. We sat down with this group here that you can see in the photo. It included the 2 immigration ladies. It included the district director of immigration sitting there at the head of the room at a desk, and Ismail, who translated for us. It was in this office that we were signing some documents to be deported from Turkey. Everything had finally come through. We were going to be deported. We had to sign one document that stated it was okay for us to be deported back to Greece. The standard procedure would be for them to put us on a plane back to Los Angeles. But of course, we needed to be back in Greece. It was in this office that we were asked to review some immigration policies that you can see here written in this book. They turned it to the English side for us, thank goodness. We were also directed to sign a couple of documents. The first document was a deportation document. We were being kicked out of Turkey. Oh no. The second document we had to sign was authorizing them to deport us back to Greece. And then I, OG, was issued a third document that I had to sign that banned me from Turkey for 2 years. I was not allowed to return until July 6th of 2020. That's why I'm making this video, folks. We're exactly at the 2-year mark. I don't have any plans of returning to Turkey anytime soon, but it's good to know that the ban is up. My daughter and I were then taken to the hospital for a third medical check. And that's where most of these photos came from. You can see us sitting in our change of clothes in the lobby, waiting around, watching TV. After we had our medical check, we were taken in a car to a nice hotel out on the strip of land near the beach. A very nice hotel. It was kind of understood that the government was paying for our room, but I had cash on me and offered to take care of our own room. I rented a room for Megan and I. You can see the hotel room here. We were ecstatic to finally be free and on our own. And we were in this hotel room. We finally figured out the air conditioner. Strange little air conditioner here that would only work if the door was closed. I guess that's pretty efficient. Got these pictures of Megan sitting out here by the bay overlooking Kusadasi. We were told that at a certain hour that Ishmael and one of the immigration ladies would come back and that we would all go to dinner. Megan and I stepped out onto the sidewalk here and got this video. It was kind of strange to be completely free, and we were able to essentially walk away. We had our passports on us. We could have disappeared right then. But soon thereafter, Ishmael showed up in a car. We drove back to a cool little restaurant where we had a big Turkish dinner, and I drank reki for the first time. It's a disgusting alcohol that the Turks seem to love. After the dinner, we went back to the hotel. One of the immigration ladies was posted in a room somewhere in the floor above us, and sometime during the middle of the night, they actually switched places because when we woke up the next morning, a different immigration lady came downstairs to meet us in the hotel lobby for breakfast in the little restaurant next door. Along with her, she brought a very young, uniformed police officer. He sat down and had breakfast with us, and I gave him some more patches and challenge coins. They took us in their car down to the customs down at the dock where Ishmael met us for a much anticipated goodbye. This group you see here in this picture is the immigration lady in the black shirt standing next to Megan. Also in a black shirt, you see Ishmael standing here in front of the cruise ship, and of course the uniformed police officer. It was at this point, the first time in my stay, that I had to go through a metal detector. And so I, of course, took off the knife that I had hanging around my neck this entire time and put it down on the scanner belt. Ishmael looked at me kind of surprised that I'd had this with me the entire time. Gone into 2 police stations, a courthouse, and a hospital. They put it in a little envelope and told me I could get it back as soon as I got off the ferry in Greece. They all waited on the dock until we were on the ferry, and they actually waited until the ferry had pulled away from the dock before they turned around and left. They were to escort us onto the boat and make sure that we left Turkey. After a 2-hour ferry ride, Megan and I arrived back in Samos, Greece. We went through Greek customs and were once again reunited with Mrs. OG, my oldest daughter, my mom, and my niece. We had missed out on a few days of touring the island, and we had only 1 day left. So we ran across the street. I grabbed my international driving permit from my hotel room, and we went downstairs and rented a crappy old French minivan and drove every single road in that island that afternoon and returned that car that evening. We saw all of the towns that we needed to see. We saw my great-grandfather's town and the house that he lived in when he died. One of our stops was in the little touristy town of Pythagorio, where we met Kostas. Kostas was the Greek customs agent who had helped Mrs. OG on her end with getting the documents across the water to Turkey and had basically been her entire contact the entire time we were gone. So we were very happy to meet him and shake his hand and thank him very much for all of the help that he had provided on the Greek side. The next morning we got on a ship back to Athens and flew out. Once we returned to the United States after our trip, I did a little investigation and was able to track down Captain Chan from the Coast Guard boat. I left a message at his command, and eventually he got back to me. We've been talking ever since. Captain Chan texts me all the time. He's best friends with Mesut, the chef who made our dinner that night. These two have become very good friends of mine. Of course, Ismail as well. And Hikmet and his wife are both in the Turkish military and have since been posted to a different town, but I keep in touch with all of these people They have become very close to us. They've become almost like family overseas. Every one of them knows that if they ever come to the United States, they have a place to stay and they have the entire hospitality. They are here with family. I hope to return to Turkey one day and see the town of Kusadasi as a tourist instead of as someone confined to a police station. Now that my ban is up, might just have to plan a trip to go back over there. I just looked up at the counter and realized that I'm almost at a feature-length video like nothing fancy, so I apologize for that. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate your comments down below if you made it through all of this. I will talk to you on the next one. I promise you the next video is going to be a little bit shorter, so bear with me. You guys be safe out there. No swimming in international waters. OG out.